Hello and welcome to the Air and Cosmos studio, where we'll discuss the situation in and around the Middle East, including Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Gaza Strip and Iran. There's a lot to cover. We are honored to welcome Michel Goya for the second time, who has written a reference book in the field. You have been involved in the area for several decades now. We're going to go back a little bit to a situation point. It all starts with the attack of October 7th last year, Israel's massive offensive on the Gaza Strip. Where are they today?
So we need to go back a bit on the strategy used by Israel. That is to say, the problem that arises for Israel after October 7th is how do we go about not just hitting an armed organization embedded in the population, but really breaking it, destroying it. There we are indeed changing the paradigm. And it's no longer about, as in 2021 and 2014, in previous conflicts, doing a few days or even a few weeks of air raids or even ground raids killing. In 2014, there were 1,500 fighters who had been killed. After a while, the rocket fire would stop and peace would be made. In fact, we made peace. Well, at this point, we were not at all in the same pattern. Here, it's about destroying Hamas. That's a very long-term strategic work, but at least destroy Hamas in Gaza, and even within that, destroy the Hamas army in Gaza.
So it was the military potential of Hamas, the ideology.
Basically, this means that we need to reach a situation where the enemy force is completely crushed, suffocated. They can't do anything anymore. They are neutralized in military terms. They are completely neutralized. They can no longer communicate. They are scared of getting bombed everywhere, and they no longer pose a threat, at least for Israel. It will take them a tremendous amount of time to potentially regenerate. So the question is, how do we get to this situation? Basically, there are two methods, either the restless method, we go inside Gaza and then we occupy the ground, we conquer it, then we occupy it, and then we completely suffocate the organization. This is a bit like what the Americans and Iraqis did in Baghdad in 2007, 2008. We go on the ground, and then after a year, the Islamic State in Iraq has almost disappeared from Baghdad. That's the first method. The issue is that it's a complex, lengthy, and resource-intensive process that is often unappreciated and costly in terms of human lives. So they decided to use a method of long-distance combat, of crushing from a distance, let's put it that way. So basically to lay a siege, a huge siege. And then we hit everything we have on anything that sticks out from Hamas. We crush everything we can from Hamas, and we complement that with ground raids to enter and clear out areas. And then the goal is to completely crush, to reach this situation of crushing with air or ground raids. But there too, it's long. We realize that it still poses a certain number of problems. Extremely large doses are required to achieve an effect. And notably, we find ourselves with an aerial campaign that is certainly the largest in volume since the Gulf War, I think, probably in '90. It is notably the most important against an armed organization in the population, so with tens of thousands of sorties and strikes, with the advantages and problems that it poses. And then afterwards, you have to go on the ground, despite everything, to clean up areas. We realized that we need a significant number of doses. So the Israelis have committed something like up to 22 full brigades inside Gaza to clean up the area. By the way, we French, from a strictly military point of view, would be very troubled if we were faced with the same challenge, to clean up, to destroy an organization in a heavily urbanized area populated by 2 million inhabitants.
Anyway, we don't have 22 brigades.
No, we would be very troubled. We would really, really be very troubled. And by the way, we don't even think about it. That's what worries me a little. I'll briefly mention that we work on urban combat, but in our centers of our hub census, exactly, but we send a company. So we work at the tactical level, that's very good. But how do we take over a millionaire area with people embedded inside by tens of thousands? Well, that's a problem that we haven't encountered yet and that we wouldn't know how to do for now.
In any case, Israel has also done it. Way, however, successful from a point of view, if we look strictly military?
Indeed, after 10 months, The Israeli says that indeed we have crushed Hamas and its allied organizations, Islamic Jihad, etc. We say that we have killed 17,000 fighters or 17,000 members of Hamas for an initial force that was perhaps 30,000 or 40,000 with the allies. Counting the seriously injured and prisoners, Hamas is crushed with total losses. So, mission accomplished. But
in Israel's image degraded by...
So now, the situation is as follows. This method was supposed to also allow to get a bit of everything else. That is to say that under pressure, Hamas and the other groups were going to release the hostages, saying, here, stop hitting us a little, then breathe a little in exchange for releasing the hostages. Not really. The method didn't really work. There are still many hostages in Gaza. But above all, Gaza is in a humanitarian situation that is a disaster. Obviously, what's happening is tragic. Half of the buildings in the territory are blown up. Territory buildings are blown up. And the worst thing is, well, there are two worst things in a way. One is that Hamas is still there. They are the ones who still effectively control most of the territory of Gaza, since the Israelis have refused to drive them out, to occupy the ground. And then two, which is related, is that there is no transition, there is no political solution. So we end up with a Gaza territory that is a closed territory. It's New York, 1997, the Carpenter film. We lay a siege around it, and then inside it you figure it out. So you have a whole population that is there, which is still getting bombed because the pressure continues, the surveillance, the pressure continues. The Israelis have set up a corridor inside the territory to better monitor it. The border and everything else are under strict lockdown. And
they said that killing the Hamas leader might have been one of their objectives.
It was just
of the display.
Yes, it's a real goal. They killed Mohammadi and Sinwar. They had to kill everyone except the last leader, Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya's brother, who is among the brains of October 7th. So it had to be done. It was part of the objectives of the list of minimum objectives to achieve, if only for psychological reasons. We killed the brains of the October 7th attack, so it's quite logical. Now, is it enough? In itself, the assassinations of leaders, it's not enough. We have to be clear. Since 1987, Israelis have killed. If we realize all the Hamas leaders that Israelis have killed since 1987, there we have to turn several pages. And it did not prevent Hamas from developing, growing in volume and efficiency. What is needed is always to double it, what we were saying earlier, by a real crushing or a suffocation, which is not quite the same thing. Well, and so there, an Israeli can say, we have achieved this crushing. Hamas no longer represents a threat, almost no more rocket fire against the territory. The idea of a raid again, like that of October 7th, it's over. And so mission accomplished, but we are in a somewhat suspended situation, which continues to maintain significant means. We still need to monitor this entire area. We need to monitor constantly. There are always fights. From time to time, we enter the internal camp, always losses on the Israeli side, even if it's greatly reduced. And above all, we are in a situation where we don't see the end very clearly. And all of this has been paid for, as you mentioned, also by a degradation of the image. The downside of this method of massive strike or raid or strike is that there is a small problem. There is a population inside, important, dense, and it has obviously suffered a lot from this method, and nothing can resist images of kids being pulled from the rubble.
They clearly assumed we prefer reproaches over condolences afterwards.
Yes, it's the old Israeli policy. Anyway, basically we are isolated. And we are in a unique, isolated situation that the rest of the world cannot understand, cannot admit. And we are in a deadly confrontation. And that justifies, in the face of people who anyway hate us, who would not be possible to make peace, it justifies a little bit of using force on the spectrum, I will say the widest, the furthest right possible in terms of, let's say, in violence.
We move on to a second point. So
Hezbollah, it's kind of the same problem. From a military point of view, that is, from the early 2000s, the Israelis considered that they had to disengage from complicated areas, quagmire areas, in fact, except the West Bank, because for them it's strategic. And so in 2000, they evacuated southern Lebanon. After 18 years of presence in Lebanon, they evacuate some 5 years later. They also evacuate Gaza. With this idea, we come back to it, that one, there is a barrier that protects us from these people. And then two, if they pose a problem, we hit them from a distance. And it's essentially the same method for everyone.
Except that Hezbollah, it was an operation that was still rather triggered by Israel at the time they wanted. It was not a response.
No, it's not a response like the October 7th attack, although Hezbollah did get involved in the conflict to some extent. Of course, not rocket fire. Rocket fire is a big strategic mistake on their part, I think. But yes, that is to say that Hezbollah, like Iran, we will say, still, I think, was a bit taken or unprepared by the October 7th attack, even if they probably knew that something was being prepared, that they did not approve of this attack, and that when it happened, they found themselves in the fait accompli and then faced with a dilemma. What do we do? Either we do nothing because it's rather in our interest, especially for Iran, to keep a low profile these days, or we go all out and engage in a full war alongside Hamas. But it's very risky against Israel and maybe even against the United States, who could get involved. So it would really be a very, very risky adventure. And finally, they have a somewhat intermediate solution. They say we're going to make a bit of a presence. And so from October 8th, Hezbollah begins to launch rockets at northern Israel. In fact, it's clear that there's a desire not to do too much, at least in terms of civilian casualties. It's really, they launch a few dozen, a maximum of 100 rockets per day. Yes, of course, during the 2006 war, they were launching 100 a day during the war, so yes. But they still take care to avoid hitting the population. It scares the population of northern Israel away. But that's the goal. You can tell they don't want to go too far, though. So a series of actions of reprisals from the Israelis is triggered on this. And so for months we have a kind of small, quite limited war of raids, of strikes, which still causes hundreds of deaths, especially on the Lebanese side, but which remains contained. You can clearly feel that on the Israeli side as well. There is a bit of this tendency, this current from the start, that says that this might also be the time to get rid of Hezbollah as a threat. Hezbollah, for the Israelis, it's a threat. It was, at least before October 7th, it was a threat considered more important than Hamas. In the latest meetings of the Israeli Security Council, Hezbollah is being discussed. A few days before the attack of Hezbollah, not from Gaza. It is considered that Gaza has pretty much got itself under control. On the other hand, many fear Hezbollah, which is indeed a more powerful organization. It's an
army that is more powerful
than the cluster. The cluster modeled itself after Hezbollah, which is more powerful, which has means, a strike force that is considerable, provided by Iran, of course. An army, a real army that is solid, that is experienced, that is inter-engaged in Syria, which
has learned to fight against Islamic State, Iraq and Syria too.
Also, well, finally, among other things, against rebel organizations, it's a solid army. Above all, when facing Hezbollah, the Israelis are always haunted by the memory of the 2006 war, which is a rather unpleasant one for them. They fell face to an unexpected resistance, much stronger than they imagined from Hezbollah. And this Israeli operation ended a bit in a fiasco. Finally, at least a half fiasco, which was quite unprecedented for the Israeli army.
A withdrawal without any result in any case?
Yes, without result, while it did a lot of damage in Lebanon, by the way. In other words, they also thought that perhaps they should avoid confronting Israel in the end. So, paradoxically, the Lebanese border was the calmest area, at least around Israel, for a very long time, because there was a form of mutual deterrence.
Thinks maybe it's the time.
It's the time, but still not the means to do everything either. Taking on two enemies simultaneously was the subject. And so obviously priority to Hamas, and from the moment Hamas, we said it, began to be really crushed. We saw it, the troop movements, concretely the 98th Division, the Israelis have 3 active divisions of conscripts who are the ones who serve as the spearhead, obviously, to all ground operations. And we see a moment they withdraw the 36th Armored Division, they bring it back. In the summer hop, we see the 98th Division going up north, and there we say, yes, indeed, priority has changed. The center of gravity of the Israeli forces has changed, and so there we prepare. They are preparing something indeed against Hezbollah and indeed the beepers. And so it started with a series of attacks, preparations, beheadings, quite remarkable. For once, it's, yes, oh, yes, yes, no, but the beeper operation, it's quite remarkable. It's perhaps the most significant targeted decapitation operation in contemporary history. So that even the more classic strikes, let's say, on the Sion Nasrallah command, the leader, all that, okay. We can discuss the human cost that it represents afterwards, but in terms of effect, it's quite remarkable. It really decapitates a good part of the organization. And then he decides to move to a much more massive action, first aiming to try to destroy as much as possible the striking force of Hezbollah, the real threat.
The missiles, mainly.
There you have it, mainly the long-range missiles. That is to say, it's both, in a way, both the easiest targets to reach. These are large objects that are harder to hide, at least, and above all, the most dangerous, because there are still ballistic missiles that can hit everything.
Israeli territory?
And with significant explosive charges nonetheless. So that's priority 1. Priority 2 is indeed the entire arsenal of rockets that can be fired, but that's more complicated, it's smaller, it's more dispersed, more numerous.
At least they managed to hit some stocks.
Yes, they managed to hit some stocks to disrupt things a bit, which means that while we were talking about a stock of maybe 100,000 rockets, we are really talking about short-range ammunition with an instantaneous firing capacity of almost 4,000 rockets. And then in the end, Hezbollah can only fire 200, 300 and relatively few missiles. That's what's a bit surprising about this case. So that's priority 2. Then 3 is to destroy all of Hezbollah's infrastructure at the border. Basically anything that allows for both short-range projectile firing and potential direct ground attacks.
So as of early November, these are still their priorities for now?
Yes, it hasn't changed. That is to say, overall, they are applying the same method they applied to Hamas. That is, they are conducting a long attrition campaign, trying to crush Hezbollah as much as possible. So by combining an air campaign and ground raids along the border. You can really feel that it's difficult. It's, despite the decapitation of Hezbollah, you have to go on. The entire border area, it's an area that was worked on by Hezbollah. There are networks of tunnels, fortifications, and then it's an organization that is very decentralized. Each sector leader knows what he has to do. The Israelis penetrate the sector, they fight the Israelis. And on
the internal impact in Lebanon is limited as Nasrallah's death led to jubilation among Sunni populations and Christians who opposed Hezbollah. Is it because there are these potential opponents to Hezbollah who could be occasional allies of Israel trying to take advantage?
Yes, it would be necessary to ally with militias given the situation. But the problem is that in
this field,
yes, bad memory. The Israeli intervention in '82 in Lebanon, it was basically in support of the phalangists of the Gemayel family, whom they hoped to make an ally that would allow them to control, neutralize, destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization in southern Lebanon, in the same way they want to destroy Hezbollah. They have largely succeeded in destroying and driving out the remnants of the Palestine Liberation Organization from Yasser Arafat at the time. In summary, Yasser Arafat had to depart for Tunisia. Afterwards, for the rest, the stabilization of Lebanon, well, it was a complete failure, since instead of the Palestine Liberation Organization, there are other organizations like Hezbollah, which have developed and even acquired a sort of legitimacy by fighting against the occupier.
What is the point of having Christian allies?
Of course, but there you have it if you want. The Lebanese, in general, the Lebanese in the current situation, they are divided between, for many, the detestation of Hezbollah, that's clear, and at the same time, the detestation of Israel. In other words, Israel, not Hezbollah, is currently attacking them. So in this kind of situation, maybe after the war, yes, there might be some settling of scores. We'll say that's enough. Where the control of Hezbollah, the importance of Hezbollah, now that's enough. And as Hezbollah has been weakened by the Israelis, maybe it has been weakened by the Israelis, it's maybe the time, but in the war, this kind of thing almost never happens. The idea that the Lebanese will come, it
wakes up now.
There, or that the Lebanese army is going to want to attack Hezbollah. No, the Lebanese army also has losses by the Israelis. So when we look at the communities, it's the Israeli invader, etc. Even
the UN has suffered some
blows
from Israel.
Yes, of course. Yes, but inevitably the blue helmets are there in the middle of a battlefield where they know nothing. It needs to be very clear. And mechanically they are forced to take hits.
Let's remember that you were a blue helmet.
Yes, not in Lebanon. I got a bit sick in Lebanon, actually. I'm going to go do a bit of a rehash of the end of our presence there. Well, it needs to be clear we knew nothing. In the same way we knew nothing when we got involved in Beirut in 83, 84, where we suffered, it must be remembered, blows from Hezbollah.
What I was going to say, nevertheless, they killed the instigator of the attacks that killed dozens of French people. At the time, Hezbollah also carried out attacks in Paris on the department stores. Yes.
Have our job.
That we haven't done for some
decades. It must still be recalled, indeed, this affair. That is to say that the idea in 82 that the Israelis penetrate Lebanon, it's in the middle of a civil war, and President Gemayel is assassinated, and we decide to intervene in Beirut. One of the very first operations in a Western coalition. So Americans, there are Italians, US, a few Brits. And as the Americans never want to work on a UN mission, we do an ad hoc thing in coalition. We go to Beirut, we put a force in Beirut, and we say we are going to serve. First we are going to serve, to evacuate, make a strong interposition, evacuate the Palestinians, that works. Afterwards we'll stay and help the new government and President Gemayel, the brother, to establish some of his authority over the capital, etc. We're going to help the Lebanese army. In fact, all of this is a decoy, and we get attacked very quickly, because at the same time, even, it must still be remembered too, we are in a very strong dispute with Iran.
Yet, it seems that we have no enemies in the region.
François Mitterrand at the UN, 2 or 3 weeks before the attack on the Drakkar on October 23rd, 1953, declared that France had no enemies in Lebanon. Well, it's absurdity. I remember that time very well.
There are terrorists on site, but they are not our enemies.
At the time, he said that there were still 19 French soldiers who had already been killed in Beirut, if I recall correctly. So at the time, we said, killed by no one, since we have no enemies. So we must remember that both Iran and Assad's Syria were involved in this case. Took advantage because we were in Lebanon, so they attacked us in Lebanon via Hezbollah, which they effectively created in 82. And in fact, initially, it's a kind of coalition. There's a small structure called the Islamic Jihad Organization, which is in charge of the attacks. And it's these people who attack us, notably on October 23rd. Not only we must polish you, there were other attacks afterwards, less deadly, but there were others who attacked the Americans, etc., and which lead to the withdrawal of this multinational force beginning 1984. We flee from Beirut. We must be clear about this. We don't know what to do. We are hit from all sides. We flee. And we must remember the huge impact this event had in the Arab world. The Arab world says we are capable of determined people, determined to the point of suicide attacks. It's a somewhat new phenomenon at the time, are able to make the most powerful armies in the world flee. And so that it's a considerable event, and I just finish on this, is that the members of the Organization of Islamic Jihad, the Organization of Islamic Jihad, in reality, it's a satellite of Hezbollah. They all join Hezbollah, for example. We find them all in the different commands. They are young, in 1900.
83, but...
We find them all at the head of Hezbollah a little later, where they regularly get shot. And Israel has put France away. Exactly.
We're still going to say that we had done an air raid. Empty? We do raids on empty places to avoid casualties, but still claim we took action.
No, but we mustn't forget this farcical scandal. It's a terrible time for France. I started my career at that time military. It's a real trauma. So yes, 2 weeks. You have to smoke it in 2 weeks' time to say, well, you have to do something anyway. After the attack on October 23rd, we say, hey, we're going to do, what can we do? We're going to do an air raid, okay? And where are we going to hit? The Hezbollah base in the Bekaa Valley. Okay. We conduct a raid of Super Etendards that depart from there. But still, we shouldn't be too mean either. You have someone at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is a big mystery who lets Hezbollah know that there will be a raid, and so the raid hits nothing. Well, hits a flock of sheep with an unfortunate shepherd who happened to be there. So it's good, but there you go. So we showed that we were doing something. And there you have it. But in reality, we didn't do anything at all.
We make a lot of digressions, and we end up with Iran nonetheless. Iran, located far away, has attempted aerial operations, including long-distance bombing and ballistic missile strikes, rather than ground operations. An unexpected success in terms of the effectiveness of Israeli ballistic air defense intercepted almost all of the ballistic missiles, at least those that are supposed to be the hardest to get. Israel responded. So where are we now?
Yes, so here we are in a kind of strange war where we can feel that Iran is a bit bothered by this affair. Something must be done, especially when we hit on its own territory, when we kill Agnier, the boss of Hamas, in Tehran itself, when we kill Nasrallah, who was Iran's main ally, we kill him in Lebanon. We say, well, there are certainly internal debates in Iran where basically, what do? We can't just sit here and do nothing without taking hits. At least for the posture, we need to show that we are here, show some solidarity with our groups, our proxies, what we see. And at the same time, we say perhaps the priority is still the preservation of the regime, which is contested from within, which is vulnerable from the outside, with an elephant in the room, which is the nuclear program, which we must still try, which is the crown jewel. So the day when the Iranians manage to have a nuclear force, that is now, it's not just fissile material, but weapons and vectorize them with a good probability of achieving goals, there the situation will be completely different. We will be in a situation like North Korea where they do a bit what they want. They do a bit what they want because they have become untouchable in this way. So in the meantime, maybe keep a low profile. And so it also leads to this idea, which actually surprised because it's still a relatively significant escalation to make an attack, an aerial one against Israel, quite massive, not with planes because the Iranians don't have the possibility, but with missiles, drones, all sorts of projectiles. So a first attack, which also provokes a somewhat strange attack. We warned it before we launched drones, so they are spotted. So we see the attack coming. We can almost talk about a pseudo-operation. That is to say, the goal is not to really do damage in Israel, but to show, there you go, show that we are doing something, that we...
Arab, so that, yes.
We also call that a salute of honor. We do a demonstration, we satisfy everyone. And the Israeli finally responded in much the same way. We remain a bit in this balance. They do a small air raid that shows...
But apparently they would have still destroyed almost all of the Iranian radars.
Yes, but I'm talking about April. The first one, well, already, so they show that they are at least capable of coming to do what they actually want. So it's the Iranian. And then a little later, so there a slightly lighter escalation on the part of the Iranians. There we only see ballistic missiles, so it's still a bit more dangerous. Two without missiles.
I think that must be that's the biggest one.
Salvo ever sent, that's right. It's the biggest ballistic missile salvo
in history.
I mean, even the Germans never launched as many V2s, for example, during the war.
Even the Russians on the first day of the war didn't do.
Even in the early days, to my knowledge, the Americans never launched 200 missiles at once.
Ballistic missiles.
Yes, it's a lot of cruises, etc. But, well, a new failure indeed. Partial failure. There are still a few that have passed. So it's both. It's also quite strange. We give defensive victories to the Israelis who can show there our shield works, functions.
It surprisingly shows they have allies like Jordan and Iraq.
Yes, it forced everyone to get involved on the road.
Others position themselves in favor of Israel to intercept Iranian missiles.
Yes, of course. It must be remembered that the American presence after the American departure from Iraq in 2011, the justification on the spot is, we will protect you from the Iranian threat. At that point, they started setting up anti-aircraft defense systems and radars everywhere that had to be connected. Then they wanted to create an anti-Iran defensive alliance in the Middle East, of which they were obviously the center, even technically forcing the Saudi radars to work with the Israeli radars. So it was a kind of de facto involvement, I was going to say, political normalization through the military means.
Knowing that they have the same enemies, the Houthis.
Saudi Arabia?
Yes, there is a convention. They are all against Iran, and it's foxy anyway.
And finally, this defensive anti-aircraft military alliance worked, and it forced, including Arab countries, to get militarily involved alongside Israel, which must be, in my opinion, quite unprecedented. We shouldn't say too much. Yes, they don't brag about it. Nobody brags about it, obviously, but I believe that I'm thinking it must be about the first time this happens that, in short, to put it simply, the Arab armies are cooperating with the Israeli army against a common enemy indeed. And so we are now in this situation where, first of all, Israel is still occupied in Lebanon. We must consider that even if the Israelis have a lot of resources, they can't do everything either. Priority on Hezbollah. This war is far from over. It is not won yet. In short, as long as there are a relatively large number of rockets falling on Israeli soil, the northern Israel area is off limits. We can't bring back the 70,000 or so residents who lived there. So the war cannot be considered as won. So it can continue, and then it can indeed continue for a very long time. All of this absorbs a lot of Israeli resources. So the somewhat military logic would be to say we might one enemy at a time. That's an old military principle. It's one at a time, and then Iran, we still have time to deal with it. And so it can stay in this situation. The Iranians, we don't feel that they necessarily have a terrible ardor to attack Israel. When we even listen to the sermons of the Supreme Guides, we don't feel it's the same.
Not a call to the...
Instant war, it's not a clear call to jihad. So we can stay in this situation. It's between Iran and Israel, at least, with this third obvious partner, which is the United States, in this situation, which can change depending on the American election, depending on Trump's title a little later if he is elected president. Things can tip over, especially in 2025, as we also get closer to the deadline of the Iranian nuclear program. For now, time is suspended on that side.
I recently returned from a 2-week trip to Ukraine where I spoke with officials who noted that Israel knows how to defend itself against anything that shoots at it, which is something the Iranians can't provide to the Russians. The constant hatred towards Iranians has led to Arab countries arming their proxy against Iran. Now Qatar is providing howitzers. The United Arab Emirates, Iraq and Kuwait are considering giving tanks as well. Official discussions have been held to provide formal, recognized support to Ukraine. Jordan, which provided systems, and Egypt, which provided shells, are historically pro-Russian, but are helping the Houthis, helping the tools, etc. They're all switching over. Blocks that are being created.
Egypt has very significant military means, notably stocks as well, things that are very important. If these countries do indeed switch to the Ukrainian side, it can change the game.
All right, thank you, Michel. Thank you. We recall your book, Michel Goya. I have the name for you, The Blaze, Understanding the Stakes of War, Israel in Mass at La Fonde and Master Editions, and of course all the links in the comments of these videos so you can go see them.
Thank you. We hope that
you enjoyed it, and we say to you...